Cancun, a place where palm trees rustle in the wind and sand glistens white under the sun. But this time, there was blood on it. This is where the story of Sativa Transu begins, a girl with a Hollywood smile and a soul that radiated light. Next to her was a guy, Taylor, a walking red flag in human form. The type mothers warn their daughters about, saying, "There's something I don't like about him," while best friends whisper, "Are you sure everything's okay with him?" Imagine November, Thanksgiving Day. Sativa dreamed of the warmth of home, a delicious turkey, and the embrace of family. Instead, she found herself in a Mexican hotel with a boyfriend who had absolutely no self-control. At first, he lashed out at the furniture and staff, and then at her. Just 2 days, and contact with her was lost. No calls, no messages, only oppressive silence. And then a voice rang out, as if from a nightmare, a voice from the American consulate: "Your daughter has been found dead in a Cancun hotel." This is where the real story begins. Not about a passionate resort romance, but about fear and the indifference of the system. About hotel security that heard the screams but did not intervene. About a doctor who wanted to help but allowed himself to be convinced otherwise. About how a heavenly corner turns into hell when you lock a victim there with her tormentor. Sativa tried to escape until the last second, already with a bag on her shoulder. But she didn't make it in time. This is not a romantic story under the palm trees. This is a chronicle of a deadly vacation. Jamie Bolo was going about her daily routine one November morning in 2021. The clock showed 9 when her phone rang. An unknown number. At first she wanted to ignore it, fearing another spam call. But something made her pick up the receiver. And as soon as she said, "Hello," her whole world turned upside down. On the other end of the line was an employee of the U.S. consulate in Mexico. Jamie felt the ground slipping from under her feet when she heard the words, "Sativa Transu, dead, hotel." Sativa, her daughter, who was just on vacation in Cancun with her boyfriend of 3 years. For Jamie, life could have stopped at that moment. But very soon she realized, she needed to act. Find the one who did this. Get justice for her girl. Sativa Transu came into the world on May 19, 1995 in the city of Spokane, Washington. At the age of 12, she moved with her parents to Cheney, a place that would later become her home. She had a younger sister, Michaela, and the girls were inseparable, more than sisters, best friends. Sativa graduated from Cheney High School in 2013, and then entered Eastern Washington University to study sports science. She dreamed of working in the fitness industry and planned to become a massage therapist. In her senior year, her infectious laughter was known to all her classmates. It was for this quality that she was chosen as one of the most charming in her class. And although it sounds like a cliché, Sativa was truly a girl who knew how to enjoy life. She adored sunny days, bright colors, good movies and hearty food. She just knew how to appreciate every moment. June 2017, right after graduation, Sativa moves to Milton, Washington. Despite the lack of acquaintances in the new city, she quickly settles in and makes friends. Her sincerity and charm leave no one indifferent. In particular, they attract the attention of Taylor Allen. They met back in Cheney when they worked together. According to mutual acquaintances, Taylor was the complete opposite of Sativa. She was like a breath of fresh air, energetic and lively. And he seemed quirky from the very beginning. More aloof and reserved than Sativa, but at the time it did not raise concerns. Their couple rather resembled a story about how opposites attract and complement each other. The problem was that Taylor was actually very insecure. He constantly doubted that he deserved Sativa, afraid that she would leave him or cheat. He himself did not fully understand the origins of these fears, but it was clear to everyone around, this was clinical paranoia. In moments of heightened anxiety, he would start monitoring the girl's correspondence through his laptop. Every message she received instantly appeared before his eyes. From the outside, Taylor seemed like the perfect boyfriend, attractive, witty, sociable. But behind closed doors, he was tormented by demons. And very soon he began to isolate Sativa from everyone. Forbade her to see family and friends. And if she still dared to go out to them, then she would get a scandal afterward. In the end, she almost stopped leaving the house, distanced herself from loved ones. As if that wasn't enough, Taylor started using. They only worsened his paranoia. Once in a conversation with a friend, Sativa let slip that in such moments he becomes a complete beast. The girl found herself in an extremely difficult situation, but her boyfriend, apparently, was even deeper in trouble. Moreover, he himself began to sell and came to the attention of the police several times. Once he was even arrested, which should have been the last straw for their relationship. When Sativa's sister Michaela came to visit, Taylor never showed his face to her. But the girl immediately noticed holes in the walls, overturned shelves, smashed furniture, broken glass. She suspected something was wrong, but Sativa kept silent. Taylor completely destroyed their relationship. Sativa found herself trapped, forced to endure his antics, even if with all her heart she wanted to leave. As soon as she would mention it, he threatened to take his own life if she left him. In November 2021, Thanksgiving arrived. Sativa really wanted to spend it with her family. She hadn't seen them for so long and just yearned to be with loved ones. But Taylor had other plans. He organized a trip to Cancun, Mexico, at the same time when Sativa was going to her parents. It is still unclear whether this was a coincidence or a deliberate plan. But many are sure that Taylor effectively blackmailed Sativa into choosing him over family. She felt how isolated she was from everyone. And in the end, she agreed. Sativa adored Cancun, it was her favorite vacation spot. So it's no wonder Taylor chose this particular city. He knew she couldn't refuse. The news of the trip shocked all the couple's friends and relatives. Their former boss, Stacy Shirley, told a story that clarified a lot. According to her, Taylor had a terrible temper. She remembers how once he was assembling a table for her at the office. Something went wrong, he got angry and smashed the furniture with a sledgehammer. This incident showed that Taylor absolutely could not cope with disappointments and failures. And his aggression often spills out on everything around. Furniture is only the first line of defense. A person who had been dating Sativa for 3 years. During this time, she tried to break up with him several times, but each time he found the right words to get her back. Obviously, Taylor had serious psychological issues that he just couldn't deal with. But in the end, Sativa still agreed to that fateful trip to Cancun. She firmly decided, after returning to Milton, she would finally end this toxic relationship. But it never happened. Because Sativa did not return from Cancun. At least not alive. On November 25, 2021, Sativa and Taylor flew to Mexico. And true to himself, Taylor could not refrain from a scandal already at the airport check-in. It seemed that the concept of peace did not exist for him, the vacation promised to be tense from the first minutes. Before boarding the plane, Sativa still wrote to her sister, congratulated her on Thanksgiving and said how much she loved her. And then photos appeared on her social networks, the sun, the beach, her smiling face. It might seem that the girl was sincerely enjoying the vacation. But just a couple of days later, Sativa's worried friends began to call Michaela. Before that, her sister was constantly in touch, sharing impressions and photos. And then suddenly, she disappeared. The phone is silent. And one of the friends told a terrible thing. The last time Sativa wrote that she and Taylor had a conflict that escalated into a physical confrontation. So serious that the girl needed medical help. Relatives sounded the alarm. It had never gone this far before, everyone was at a loss as to how everything could have gone downhill so quickly. They tried to call Sativa, in vain. They wrote, no answer. Anxious hours gave way to even more anxious ones. The girl's phone remained silent. All messages were left unread. At dawn the next day, Jamie, Sativa's mother, was awakened by a phone call that forever divided her life into before and after. At the end of November 2021, on one fatal day, the life of Sativa Transu's loved ones stopped. The American consulate in Mexico called her mother, and the words she heard were like a punch in the gut. Sativa was found dead in a hotel room. Her body was not just lifeless. It eloquently testified to the terrible events that preceded the girl's death. Every inch of her skin was covered in bruises and injuries, the sight of which made one's blood run cold. For Sativa's relatives, an exhausting struggle for the truth began. They tried to figure out how and why it happened, overcoming distances and language barriers. There were more questions than answers, but they were not going to back down. Michaela, the sister of the deceased, together with other family members, collected information bit by bit. Eyewitness accounts, surveillance camera footage, police reports, everything was used to reconstruct the events of that tragic day. And it started quite ordinarily, as much as possible when you are in a foreign country with a person next to whom you do not feel safe. On the evening of November 26, Sativa and her boyfriend Taylor were seen in a restaurant. According to witnesses, everything looked peaceful between them. But this illusion of tranquility was very soon dispelled. After dinner, the couple went to the bar. They drank, and at some point Sativa noticed that Taylor was openly flirting with another patron. For the girl, this was the last straw. All the pain from the toxic relationship, all her attempts to break out of it, all this was negated by one moment of betrayal before her eyes. When Taylor, who was 31 at the time, was caught red-handed, he behaved like a spoiled child. Threw a tantrum, started throwing things and turning everything around. The security of the establishment was forced to throw him out the door. On the way to the hotel, he continued to behave inappropriately, jumping over fences, falling, muttering something incomprehensible. The staff asked Sativa to keep him in the room until morning. But even once in the room, Taylor did not calm down. Soon, calls began to come to the reception, female screams were heard from the couple's room. When the hotel employees went up to the fourth floor, a shocking sight awaited them. Before them stood Sativa with a deep wound on her chin, which stretched for a good 4 centimeters. What exactly happened behind closed doors is not known for certain. But all signs pointed to a brutal skirmish in which the girl was seriously injured. The cut was so deep that stitches had to be applied. Sativa was taken to the lobby, where she was examined by a doctor. At this time, Taylor, being in complete prostration, climbed out of the room window and found himself near the air conditioners. The guards found him there when he was babbling something about jumping from the balcony and could not understand where he was. The staff called the police, but by the time they arrived, Taylor had already been taken back to the room. So it turned out that the law enforcement officers did not talk to him or Sativa then. Perhaps if they had, subsequent events would have unfolded quite differently. While the girl's wound was being sutured, she kept repeating that she had fallen herself. She insisted that Taylor had not hit her, that they loved each other. According to the medic who provided assistance, he suggested that Sativa spend the night in another room. But she supposedly refused. Michaela could not believe these statements. She was outraged that her sister, finding herself in a foreign country, without knowledge of the language, suffered from the cruelty of a man who was physically much stronger than her. In her opinion, Sativa was simply too scared and did not even understand the doctor's offer. The girl was indeed transferred to another room on the first floor to prevent Taylor's attempts to jump out of the window again. And what happened next, no one knows. The only thing that is known, deep into the night, desperate female screams were heard again from the couple's room. But this time, no one called, not even the reception. No one called the police. Everyone who heard those blood-curdling wails just turned away and pretended nothing had happened. The head of hotel security also heard everything. But he did not take any action. The employees of the establishment and the guards were allegedly simply afraid of Taylor, a big guy with outbursts of aggression. They should have been responsible for the safety and comfort of guests, but in the end they were just afraid to intervene. In the morning, Taylor came out of the room, seemingly calm and in his right mind. He informed the administrators that his girlfriend was unconscious. When the staff finally unlocked the door, a horrifying picture opened before their eyes. Sativa was lying on the floor by the bed, face down. From head to toe, her body was dotted with bruises and scratches. A bag still hung over her shoulder. It seems the girl was trying to escape from Taylor, to pack her things and leave. But she did not make it in time. The investigators who arrived at the scene almost immediately realized, Sativa had not just lost consciousness. She was dead. The body was sent for autopsy. The forensic expert stated without hesitation, death was preceded by a brutal beating. The girl was simply unrecognizable. Taylor had beaten her to death with his own hands. On Sativa's body, many traces were found that indicated that she had desperately defended herself. But all her efforts were in vain. A slender girl weighing 63 kilograms had no chance against an enraged Hulk of 100 kilograms. She was defenseless against his unrestrained cruelty. Sativa's death turned out to be so terrible and senseless that her loved ones still cannot recover. They blame themselves for not noticing the signs of trouble in time and not being able to prevent the tragedy. Now the police had to find the killer. And very soon all the evidence began to point to Taylor Allen. He was immediately arrested. Since Sativa was originally from Washington and died in Cancun, the family wanted to bring the body home. In her homeland, they planned to conduct another autopsy and bury the girl where she was born and raised. But the procedure of transporting across the border turned out to be very expensive. The family simply did not have that kind of money. Michaela opened a page to raise funds. She was determined to bring her sister home, give her a dignified farewell, and achieve justice. The girl was not going to give up. She was ready to do anything to ensure that the one who Sativa was, kind, bright, loving, would finally find peace. The only mistake of the deceased was that she endured Taylor's cruelty for too long, not daring to leave. The trial in Sativa's case took place in Mexico. This created additional difficulties. Relatives had to overcome huge distances, face a language barrier, spend a lot of time and resources on flights. On December 8, 2021, the family managed to hire a lawyer who began to cooperate with the prosecutor in this case. And the next day, Sativa's body was finally delivered to the USA. Relatives were able to say goodbye to her and accompany her on her final journey. But the story did not end there. The family was promised that the case would be referred to one of the strictest judges in Mexico. With the onset of 2022, Taylor's defenders requested 2 more months for additional investigation. The court granted this petition. But despite the fact that more than 2 years have passed since then, there is no news about the course of the process. The prosecutor's office demanded the maximum punishment for Taylor under Mexican law for such crimes, 50 years in prison. But why the sentence has not yet been passed is unknown. There are rumors that in a Mexican prison, Taylor tried to join a cartel and bribe someone to get out. But it seems he did not succeed. Sativa's relatives hope that after all these months of pain and tribulation, justice will finally prevail. But Taylor, apparently, was not the only one who should be held responsible for the girl's death. Michaela suspects that Taylor's mother, Rosa Duran, broke into Sativa's apartment after her death and stole valuables, including a safe and keys to both cars. Rosa constantly called the residential complex, begging to be let into Sativa's home. But since her name was not on the lease, the woman was refused each time. Shortly after her persistent calls, someone still got into the apartment. And then Rosa suddenly stopped calling. In addition, it was she who kept Shedl, Sativa's service dog. Although the girl never gave permission for this and was going to pick him up immediately after returning from Mexico. Relations between Rosa and Sativa have always been strained. The girl believed that Taylor's mother constantly controls her son and tries to manipulate them both so that after the vacation they move closer to her. It seems this woman also has to answer for her actions. Michaela set herself the goal of helping women who find themselves in toxic relationships, like her sister. She wants to teach them to recognize the warning signs and not be afraid to ask for help. The girl believes that Sativa would want her story to change someone's life and save someone from making the same tragic mistake. Michaela vowed not to stop until no woman has to go through what her sister endured. A sinister discovery in a metal suitcase shocked the police of Yorkshire in January 2002, the body of a young Korean woman. This horrific find marked the beginning of an investigation that led to the trail of one of the country's most chilling killers. His name is Kim Kyu-so, a native of South Korea, born in 1971 or 1972. Little is known about his life before this, except that in September 2001, after an unsuccessful marriage, he left his homeland and went to London with the intention of studying English in the capital of the United Kingdom. However, already in October 2001, Kim quit his studies and started earning a living by renting out 2 apartments, one on Eagle Street near Holborn, known as the legal quarter of London, and a duplex on Gaster Street in the Poplar area. To get his business off the ground, he placed ads for his services on several websites. Most of his tenants were visiting students, many of them Koreans like Kim himself. At that time, he had a girlfriend, Marika Ijimura, a young Japanese woman who worked as a hairdresser. Marika occupied the main bedroom of the apartment on Eagle Street, while 2 Korean female tenants shared the second room. Those who knew Kim usually described him as a benevolent, polite and pleasant man with a constant smile on his face. He was charming with everyone, but especially with young girls. Somehow he managed to convince people that he came from a wealthy family and had a good financial standing and lifestyle himself. However, this was all just an illusion. In reality, Kim's financial affairs were in absolute disarray. He had huge debts hanging over him, and all his credit cards were blocked. Moreover, he and Marika often used prohibited By September 2001, their relationship seemed to have reached a dead end. And the young woman, who was almost 10 years younger than Kim, was hardly ever seen in the apartment. It was under these circumstances that Kim met Jin Hyun-jong, a girl from a South Korean province who rented a room from him for just 3 days. Jean was studying French literature at a Korean university and had spent several months at the University of Lyon in France as part of an exchange program. After finishing her studies, she decided to stay for a few more days to see the sights of Paris and London before returning home, where her brother and parents were waiting for her. Jean arrived in the British capital on Wednesday, October 24, 2001, and was supposed to return to France on Saturday, October 27. She found Kim's ad on the internet and agreed with him to rent a room in the apartment on Eagle Street. However, the girl's plans were interrupted in the most terrible way, and her young life was cut short suddenly and tragically. On the evening of October 26, a day before her scheduled return to France, the 19-year-old student became a victim of Kim's brutal attack. The exact details of what happened were never revealed, but it is known that when they were alone, the man took Jin's life by wrapping her face with duct tape so that she could not breathe. He also tied her wrists. Before subjecting the girl to these tortures, Kim, threatening, forced Jin, who seemed to offer no resistance, to tell him the PIN codes for her credit cards, information he was going to use later. Then he stuffed her body into a metal suitcase and hid it in a closet in the main bedroom. The corpse lay there for the next 5 days. When other residents returned to the apartment on Friday and asked where Jean was, Kim lied that she had decided to return to France a day early and that he had allegedly taken her to the train station. He told a similar story, with some variations, to the girl's friends and relatives, who began to sound the alarm when Jean did not return to France on time and actually disappeared without a trace. On Saturday, October 27, a day after committing the horrific crime, Kim took both of his victims' cards and began to empty her bank accounts. First, he tried to withdraw money from a card of the South Korean Kookmin Bank, which was linked to a family account. It had been opened by Jin's parents for emergencies, and the girl herself had never used it. The first theft attempt failed because Kim entered the wrong PIN code. But a few days later, he tried again and managed to withdraw £1,990. Kim tried to withdraw more, but Jin's family account was already empty. The other card was issued by a French bank where the girl kept her personal savings while living in France. Kim handed this card to a young Korean woman and asked her to go to Paris to withdraw as much cash as possible from the card. Although such a request should have aroused suspicion, Kim managed to deceive the girl by saying that the card belonged to his girlfriend Marika and by making up a plausible reason why he urgently needed money. Apparently, his explanation sounded convincing enough for the girl to agree to carry out his request. But in reality, there was a much more sinister intent behind it. Kim did not just want to take possession of all his victims' money, but also sought to reinforce his lie that Jean had supposedly gone to Paris. To do this, he needed to create the illusion that the girl had used her card in the French capital. He hoped to confuse the police, who would inevitably start investigating the student's sudden disappearance, with false leads. Late in the evening on Wednesday, October 31st, Kim put the suitcase with Jin's body in the trunk of a rented car. Then he drove for almost 4 hours to the village of Ascrick in North Yorkshire. There, on the side of a deserted road, he threw out the suitcase with Jin's mutilated corpse and returned to his apartment. Kim pretended as if nothing had happened. He continued to rent out rooms and repeated the same false explanations whenever one of the victim's acquaintances asked about her. Between November 17th and 18th, a young Korean woman named Song-in moved into Kim's duplex on Gaster Street. At first, she shared the main bedroom with a friend named Moon, but already on November 29th, Moon had to return to her native Korea, and Song remained alone in the apartment. Everyone who knew Song described her as a friendly and smiling girl, and in her family, she was considered an exemplary daughter. There are some discrepancies regarding what exactly she was doing in London. According to some reports, she was studying hotel management, while others say she came to learn English after studying at a Korean university. While Song was living in the duplex, she and Kim became very close, although it is not known for certain whether there was any romantic or relationship between them. However, some people who saw them together said that they behaved like brother and sister. In addition, Song's friend later recounted that the girl had once let slip that she felt a special affection from Kim. But she never once hinted that these feelings were mutual. However, on December 3, 2001, Kim suddenly asked all the residents of the apartment on Eagle Street to move out, including Marika, with whom he no longer had a relationship at that time. Then he himself left the apartment and moved into the duplex on Gaster Street, where Song lived. For the next few days, they were very close. And the girl did not even suspect that a real monster was hiding behind the mask of friendliness. Song was last seen alive on December 7, when she had lunch with Kim at a Korean restaurant. She had no idea what a terrible fate would befall her in just a few hours. Kim dealt with Song as insidiously and cruelly as he had with Jean a few months before. He tied her wrists and ankles with duct tape, stuffed a sock in her mouth, and then sealed her mouth and nose. As a result, the 22-year-old girl slowly and painfully suffocated. Acting according to an already proven scheme, Kim took care to find out his victim's bank details before putting his monstrous plan into action. Then he hid her body in a closet in the duplex hallway and sealed the door so that no one could open it. Song's remains lay there for several months. When the girl's acquaintances asked where she was, Kim replied that she had supposedly gotten a job at a hotel and was now living in a dormitory for the staff. As it turned out, Song-in had 2 bank accounts, one with British NatWest, and the other with Korean Kookmin Bank. The latter was a joint family account for emergencies, which the girl had used only once in her life. Kim Kyu-so used the NatWest card to withdraw £240 in cash from an ATM. With this money, he bought a ticket to Toronto, where he flew on December 13. But before leaving, the insidious killer also robbed his victim's account at the Korean bank, stealing a total of £1,200. Kim managed to get to Toronto without any problems. There he rented an apartment and again started renting out rooms, reproducing the same business model as in London. The man planned to stay in Canada for a year or two, and it seemed that he had managed to avoid punishment for these terrible crimes. But in reality, the story was far from over. While Kim continued to live his normal life after strangling Jean and getting rid of her body in a suitcase, the girl's loved ones did not stop looking for her. When Jean did not return from England at the appointed time, her worried friends in France contacted her relatives in Korea. Trying in vain to find the missing girl, her brother posted information about her on a Korean website dedicated to the search for missing persons. It was there that her photograph was later seen by a Korean policeman who was studying in London at the time. The fact that Jean turned out to be one of many missing Korean students caught the officer's attention, because just a few days before, news reports had mentioned the discovery of the lifeless body of a young Asian woman stuffed into a suitcase. The gruesome find was made on January 18, although, as it later turned out, the suitcase was first noticed 2 weeks earlier. However, since this happened in a sparsely populated rural area, no one ever reported it to the authorities. Until one of the local residents tried to take the suitcase and was surprised at how heavy it was. This seemed extremely suspicious to the man. When the police arrived at the scene in the middle of the night and shined a flashlight on the suitcase, they saw human hair and eyes through the cracks. The horrifying luggage was urgently taken to the morgue of North Yorkshire, where it was finally opened. Inside, they found the body of a girl, almost completely naked, except for a bra. The victim's height barely exceeded 150 centimeters, and her head and limbs were tightly wrapped with adhesive tape. The investigators' attention was immediately drawn to the unusual decoration of the tape used. It was a decorative dark blue tape manufactured by 3M with a distinctive print in the form of male faces. As the police soon found out, this tape was designed by London artists Gilbert and George, and it went on sale in September 2000. It was sold exclusively in the souvenir shops of the Tate Gallery in London, Liverpool and Cornwall. In total, according to the investigation, 851 rolls were sold. This information would later prove extremely important for solving the crime. Examining the body, the pathologist was struck by the absence of any signs of struggle on the part of the victim. This led him to think that the girl had probably been drugged before being tied up. The expert suggested two possible scenarios: either there was some unknown substance in the victim's body that was not detected during the toxicological analysis, or the girl was somehow deceived or threatened to allow her hands to be tied. The forensic examination began with a study of the hair, which confirmed that the deceased was from Southeast Asia. However, the police were unable to identify her by fingerprints using the national database. The investigators were able to establish the victim's identity only on January 2, 2002. This happened after the Korean policeman, who had seen the missing person report for Jean and learned about the body found in the suitcase, contacted the Yorkshire police to inform them of a possible connection between these events. The British law enforcement officers contacted the Korean embassy and gained access to the fingerprint database of South Korean citizens. The comparison made it possible to find out that the deceased was none other than Jean Hyunjong. And shortly before that, on December 17, 2001, the police had also declared Song In-hee wanted after her alarmed friends reported her disappearance. So on January 7, 2002, when the Serious Crime Directorate of the Metropolitan Police learned about the discovery of Jin's body, investigators suspected that both incidents might be related. Thus, the North Yorkshire Police and detectives from London began a joint investigation under the leadership of Chief Constable Alan Ankers. Since Song was initially considered simply missing, and her body had not yet been found, the investigators decided to start with Jin's case. Thanks to information obtained from the deceased's friends and relatives, the police were able to track her movements up to her arrival at the apartment on Eagle Street. During a search of the dwelling, they found a whole roll of the exact same adhesive tape that Jean had been bound and strangled with. On the sticky side of the tape, as well as on the baseboards, walls, sofa and carpet in the room, experts found traces of the young Korean woman's blood. As for the missing Song In-hee, the investigation knew that the girl had last rented a room in a house on Gaster Street. After carefully analyzing all the connections between the residents of this house, as well as the apartment on Eagle Street, the police found out that both dwellings were run by none other than Kim Kyu-so, who was already in Canada at that time. Having studied the records of the suspect's telephone conversations, the investigators established that during the period when the suitcase with the body was thrown out in North Yorkshire, he was just in that area. And during an inspection of the car that Kim had rented in October 2001, criminalists found traces of Jin's blood. All the evidence found unambiguously indicated that both crimes had been committed by one and the same person. So the police finally had their main suspect, Kim Kyu-so. On January 17, 2002, the Metropolitan Law Enforcement officers, together with the North Yorkshire Police, held a press conference urging the public to provide any information about the two missing girls. And in the evening of the same day, fate played a cruel joke on the killer himself. Kim, who had just returned to London, carelessly went to an internet cafe, where he was recognized and arrested. The man was charged with the murder of Jin Hyun-jang and taken into custody. On January 21, the suspect appeared before the magistrate's court. His lawyer petitioned for release on bail, but the judge rejected this request. Kim was left in custody until the start of the trial, scheduled for the 28th of the same month. However, as often happens, the date of the hearing was later postponed. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation into the missing Song In-hee. And on March 14, 2002, there was an unexpected breakthrough in the case. A builder named Paul Min, who was carrying out repair work in one of the rooms of the duplex on Gaster Street, noticed that a strange number of flies were flying out from under the decorative panels. This seemed suspicious to the man, and he immediately reported it to the police. The next day, investigators arrived at the scene. While inspecting the dwelling, they noticed a sealed wall cabinet in the hallway. When the police officers opened it, they saw inside a pile of stinking clothes, and behind it, a naked female body wrapped in a sheet. The examination later confirmed that the remains found belonged to the missing Song In-hee. Interestingly, the investigators had already visited this duplex on January 9, 2002, during a previous search. But then they only found things that belonged to Jin, the first victim. The police officers somehow did not notice the sealed cabinet with the second body at that time. The forensic experts found that the adhesive tape that Song's face, wrists and ankles were wrapped with was identical to the one the killer had used in Jin's case. However, this time Kim had squeezed the lower part of the victim's face with such force that her eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. However, despite all the killer's cruelty, no signs of sexual violence were found on the bodies of either girl. Additional DNA testing of Song In-hee's personal belongings found in the same cabinet showed that some of them, including clothes and shoes, actually belonged to Jin. On April 4, 2002, Kim Kyu-so was officially charged with the murder of Song In-hee. On May 7, the man was to appear before the Central Criminal Court to give evidence. At this hearing, he refused through an interpreter to admit his guilt in the intentional murder of both girls, both Jin and Song. Although the start of the full trial was scheduled for September 30 of the same year, in fact, the substantive consideration of the case began only in March 2003. At the same time, Kim refused to answer any questions during the cross-examination and did not want to testify in court at all. However, on the second day of the hearing, in the presence of the jury, the defendant did confess to the unintentional killing of Song In-hee. He claimed that it was just an unsuccessful erotic game that led to an accidental tragedy. But the court rejected this formulation of guilt. The trial continued. Kim Kyu-so was never able to explain what prompted him to commit these monstrous crimes. In his speech before the jury, prosecutor Jonathan LeBlanc voiced several possible motives of the defendant. In his opinion, Kim could have been pushed to the murders by psychosexual problems or banal greed, because the man was suffering from debts. It is also possible that on the morning of September 5, 1978, as the sun began to pierce through the early fog, police cars with sirens blaring raced through the streets of the town of Rosamond in Los Angeles, California. Their target was a small apartment building where, according to reports, something horrific had occurred. At the door of one of the apartments, they were met by a woman who could barely stand from what she had seen. This was Ellen Woolley, the mother of the girl whose body had just been discovered in the apartment. Only yesterday they had spoken on the phone, and today her daughter was already dead. News of the gruesome find spread like wildfire through the town, and the residents of Rosamond could not believe that such a thing could happen in their quiet corner. The family of the deceased girl, despite all their efforts, was forced to wait for answers for more than 2 decades. The murder case passed from one detective to another, gathering dust on archive shelves, until a new generation of investigators opened the old boxes of evidence and stumbled upon a detail that had previously been overlooked. The victim turned out to be Tana Woolley, who was born on July 19, 1958 in Los Angeles. She was the daughter of William Price and Ellen Woolley and grew up with 3 brothers and sisters in the small town of Rosamond, Kern County. Her father held the position of test manager at a nearby Air Force base, and her mother worked as a teacher at the local high school. Thanks to a stable income, the family could afford a good home and provide their children with everything they needed, and most importantly, love, support, and time spent together. It was in this atmosphere that Tana grew up, gradually turning into a bright, charismatic girl full of life. As a teenager, she joined the youth branch of the Masonic organization and was also an active member of the student government at her school. In 1976, when she turned 18, Tana graduated from high school with honors. A beauty with excellent grades, she seemed destined for a brilliant future. At 20, Tana won the title of Miss Rosamond at the local beauty pageant. However, the girl decided not to tie her life to the modeling business. Instead, she got a job as a secretary in the NASA administration and simultaneously enrolled in a college in the Valley, where she began studying at the pedagogical faculty. Tana dreamed of working with children with special needs after graduation and dedicating her life to their development. But all these plans were shattered one terrible night. It was October 1978. Tana, who had recently started an independent life, was renting an apartment in her hometown. However, she did not spend much time there, often staying with her boyfriend, 18-year-old Ricky Max Ross. And the girl was also uncomfortable being in her apartment due to the suspicious types she noticed in the area. Tana shared her concerns with her mother and friends but never dared to move. Instead, she developed her own safety plan. When she returned late in the evening from Ricky's place, he would always walk her to the door of the apartment. And only after making sure that the girl had locked the door behind her would the young man go home. Everything was going well until the morning of October 25. Around 9:30 a.m. Ellen received a call from Tana's boss. The girl, who was never late, had not shown up for work today. The mother tried to call her daughter, but she did not answer. Ellen's heart told her that something bad had happened, so she immediately rushed to Tana's apartment. The woman's worst fears were confirmed. The front door was slightly ajar, and the lock was broken. Crossing the threshold, Ellen found herself in a ransacked living room. Things were strewn all over the floor, and furniture was overturned. It seemed that a serious struggle had taken place here. The woman called out to Tana, but in response, she heard only her own echo. Finally, Ellen dared to enter her daughter's bedroom. And there, on the bed, she saw the most terrifying sight of her life. Tana lay dead, undressed to the waist. Her body was covered in bruises and bloody wounds, and around her neck was a cord made from her own sock. Crying in despair, Ellen called the police. When the officers arrived at the scene, they quickly formed a preliminary picture of the event. Most likely, Tana had been the victim of rape and then strangled with her own sock. The girl's body was taken to the morgue for examination. Forensic experts established the time of death, between 10 and 11 o'clock the previous evening. The cause was a blow to the head with a blunt object, followed by asphyxiation. The fact that Tana had been raped before her death was evidenced not only by the ransacked room but also by traces of DNA found in her body. However, the police did not rule out the possibility that sexual intercourse had taken place earlier and was consensual, and had nothing to do with the murder. No other genetic material was found at the crime scene that would indicate the identity of the killer. It seemed that the criminal had acted extremely carefully, professionally hiding the traces. After questioning Tana's neighbors, the detectives found out that the day before, around 10:30 p.m., some had heard muffled screams coming from the girl's apartment. But they quickly died down, so no one paid much attention to it. Little could happen in a house full of life and laughter. Examining the apartment, the investigators concluded that the killer, before breaking in, had been watching Tana for several days. He knew when the girl was alone and took advantage of it. And since nothing was missing from the apartment, the attack seemed not to have been aimed at robbery from the very beginning. Another telling detail: had used a condom. So he had come prepared and planned the sexual assault. But the murder most likely happened spontaneously. Tana was probably resisting and calling for help, so the attacker, in order to silence her, grabbed the first thing that came to hand, her own sock. And, willfully or accidentally, strangled the girl. Weeks passed after the discovery of Tana's body, and the investigation still had no suspects. People began to say that the Kern County Police were powerless to solve this crime. But in fact, the detectives were simply drowning in numerous cases. Eventually, the FBI joined the investigation. Special agents from the Criminal Behavior Analysis Department, who specialized in serial criminals, compiled a preliminary portrait of Tana's killer. It had to be a tall, physically developed young man between the ages of 15 and 25. A person who works a lot with his hands and probably has problems with the law in the past. Smart, but embittered by failures in his personal life. And although this was probably his first murder, it was not his first rape. The first to be interrogated was Tana's boyfriend Ricky. He said that on the night in question, they were watching TV and playing games together in his apartment. Around 10 in the evening, as usual, Ricky walked the girl home. Several witnesses confirmed that they saw Ricky and Tana saying goodbye at the entrance. This removed any suspicion from the young man. But before leaving, the young man told the detectives an important detail. In recent weeks, Tana had complained to him that she had noticed a suspicious man near the house. He seemed to be watching her, lurking when she took out the garbage or left the apartment, prowling the corridors. More than once he even tried to meet her, despite the girl's refusals. He was a tall, hefty African-American man, and his description perfectly matched the profile compiled by FBI experts. Realizing that the investigation had reached a dead end, Tana's relatives decided to act on their own. They hired a private detective, Lou Smaglovich, who first went to the residential complex where the deceased girl lived. He methodically went from apartment to apartment, questioning all the residents. Lou tried to identify someone who would behave suspiciously, especially single men who would have the opportunity to pursue Tana for several days, waiting for the right moment to attack. Eventually, one name began to be heard more often than others: Larry Heslett. This 56-year-old man, who worked as a school teacher, was given a telling nickname in the complex: the neighborhood pervert. He lived in apartment number 5, right next to Tana's bedroom. And although the entrance to his apartment faced the other way, the window looked directly at the girl's window. Larry could sit there for hours, watching his neighbor's every move. Lou decided to ask Tana's boyfriend Ricky about Larry. The young man confirmed, it was because of the strange neighbor from apartment 5 that the girl felt uncomfortable in her own home. The information seemed crucial, although Larry's age did not quite match the profile compiled by the FBI experts. Smaglovich understood, Heslett needed to be detained as soon as possible. However, there was a lack of evidence for this. So he passed the information he had gathered to the police, hoping that they would find a way to interrogate the suspect. During the first interrogation, Larry behaved surprisingly calmly. He claimed that at the time of the murder he was in a nearby store. But neither the salespeople nor the other customers could confirm this. Catching Heslett in a lie, the police took his fingerprints and arrested him. Unfortunately, no traces of the suspect were ever found at the crime scene. In the end, due to lack of evidence, Larry had to be released. 5 months after Tana's death, Larry Heslett disappeared from the city. It seemed that with him disappeared the hopes of solving the case. The investigation reached a dead end and was later discontinued. However, Ellen Woolley, the mother of the deceased, did not lose hope. She believed that one day she would be able to look into the eyes of her daughter's killer. For the next 20 years, the woman tirelessly called the police, trying to find out about any progress in the case. During this time, more than one generation of investigators changed, each of whom had to start work from scratch. Eventually, the baton was taken from the mother by Tana's younger sister, Taryn. She persistently, albeit tactfully, persuaded the police to resume the investigation. In March 1999, during another call, Taryn mentioned the high-profile case of O.J. Simpson. Thanks to the latest DNA analysis technologies, it was then possible to prove the athlete's guilt, although he had previously been acquitted. The girl suggested that the same approach could be applied to the physical evidence in her sister's case, in particular to the ominous sock. But the police were in no hurry to agree. However, Taryn did not give up. She dialed the number of the police station again and again until she managed to talk to Sergeant Chris Pierce. He promised to personally take up the Tana Woolley case. First of all, he delved into the old archives. In the 70s, investigators did not record details too carefully, so there was a lack of information. However, Pierce managed to find several important mentions, a request for fingerprints and the name of Larry Heslett, the same suspect that Private Detective Smaglovich had identified 20 years ago. Chris Pierce decided to dig deeper into Heslett's past. It turned out that back in 1969, Larry was accused of armed robbery and rape, but only the assault and resistance during the arrest could be proven. And in 1973, he was suspected of another, but the victim withdrew the statement and the case was closed. When Tana died, Larry moved to Sacramento. There he got married, had children, and worked as a music teacher at a school. However, even in his new place, Heslett did not refrain from problems with the law. From 1979 to 1991, he was accused of burglary, indecent exposure, molestation of minors, and 5 more cases of violence. Larry was officially considered a although, surprisingly, he never ended up behind bars. Despite his solid criminal record, Chris Pierce still did not have sufficient grounds to arrest Heslett specifically on suspicion of Tana's murder. The statutes of limitations had long expired for those few allegations of that had come from other women. The sergeant understood that everything needed to be carefully weighed before issuing a warrant. Having found out Larry's new address, Pierce went to Sacramento. On October 5, 1999, he knocked on the door of a small house in a quiet neighborhood. The man who opened it did not look like a brutal killer at all. He was living peacefully in the suburbs, and none of his neighbors even suspected his gloomy past. Chris Pierce showed Larry the warrant and asked him to submit a DNA sample. The man, it seemed, was not at all nervous. He submissively gave a swab of saliva and repeated, he did not know Tana Woolley and was happy to help the investigation. The sergeant took the sample and returned to his hometown, hoping that the laboratory would find a match. In early 2000, expert Brenda Smith took up a re-examination of the physical evidence collected 20 years ago in Tana's apartment. The traces of semen found in the body of the deceased turned out to be too degraded for a full DNA analysis. Then Brenda turned her attention to the clothes and bedding. Using a special lamp, she found several small spots of a yellowish tint on the bedspread. After carefully examining them, the expert was able to obtain samples of genetic material. It remained only to compare them with the DNA that Larry Heslett had submitted. The match turned out to be incredible. The computer gave the result, 1 chance in 126 billion. Brenda Smith immediately called the Kern County Police Department. Now the investigators had good reason to arrest Larry Heslett. However, the prosecutors still had doubts. After all, the defense could argue that the traces of semen got to the crime scene as a result of voluntary sexual intercourse, and the man had nothing to do with Tana's murder. A few days later, Detective Hikes visited Larry's home. The man behaved surprisingly calmly and even turned on a dictaphone to record his own testimony. Larry denied ever entering Tana's apartment or being intimate with her. But the results of the DNA examination indicated otherwise. Hikes informed Heslett that biological traces had been found at the crime scene that unequivocally linked him to the murder. And only then did the suspect get nervous. He continued to deny everything, refused further comments, and demanded a lawyer. At that very moment, Larry Heslett was arrested on suspicion of premeditated murder. However, the man did not admit guilt. So the prosecutors had doubts whether they would be able to prove his guilt, relying only on indirect genetic evidence. In December 2002, the case was taken over by prosecutor Ed Jagels. He suggested that Heslett could claim in court about a secret romance with Tana, which would allegedly explain the presence of his DNA at the crime scene. To refute this version, Jagels sought help from an experienced investigator, Trent Proles. Together they began to dig into Larry's dirty laundry. And they did hit a goldmine. It turned out that, in addition to Tana Woolley, Heslett was suspected of 4 other women. Moreover, 3 of the victims appeared even before Tana's murder, and 1 after it. Ed Jagels and Trent Proles found these women and took their testimony. Although Larry's victims had never met and did not know about each other, their stories coincided strikingly. Each said that immediately after the attack, she went to the police. But then none of them dared to give the case a go and appear before the court. Even 30 years later, they still preferred not to stir up painful memories. However, when the investigators told them about Tana's death, the women felt guilty. After all, if they had had the courage to see the case through to the end, then the young girl would most likely have remained alive. So now all 4 agreed to testify against Larry. It turned out that Heslett acted according to a similar scenario. At first, he behaved politely and amicably, but as soon as the victim was left alone with him, he became cruel and aggressive. He bit one of the witnesses so hard that scars still remained on her body. These chilling stories convincingly proved Larry was a serial rapist. But Ed Jagels wanted to gather even more evidence against him. Preparing for the trial, the prosecutor visited the forensic laboratory to personally look at the sock with which the murder was committed. He asked the expert to carefully examine both items. Brenda Smith suggested that skin cells from the killer's hands could have been preserved on the fibers. So she carefully scraped off the top layer of fabric and isolated DNA from there. The genetic profile again pointed to Larry Heslett. And although the match was incomplete, there were enough traces to link him to the murder weapon with high probability. This refuted any attempts to pass off the traces of semen at the crime scene as a consequence of voluntary sex. Now there was more than enough evidence. The jury had to be convinced, Larry strangled Tana with her own sock. On June 10, 2002, Ed Jagels began the trial of Larry Heslett. The testimony of 4 victims, the results of DNA examination, and traces of the suspect's genetic material on the murder weapon, all this evidence left no doubt for the jury. Heslett was a serial rapist. At the same meeting, an FBI expert spoke, who recreated the probable course of events on the night of Tana's murder. In his opinion, it happened like this. On September 25, 1978, when Ricky dropped the girl off at the house, she went up the stairs to her floor. At this time, Larry Heslett, who had been watching Tana for several weeks, was lurking in the neighboring apartment. The frightened girl tried to quickly close the door, but Larry turned out to be stronger and broke inside. A fight broke out in the living room, because of which the room turned into complete chaos. This was later evidenced by the numerous bruises on Tana's body and the scattered things that her mother saw. Eventually, Heslett caught up with the girl in the bedroom, threw her on the bed and continued to abuse her. He realized that the victim could recognize him, since they were neighbors, and therefore decided to shut her mouth. Larry grabbed a sock that accidentally fell into his hands and ruthlessly strangled Tana. The hearing in the Heslett case lasted a whole week. Just an hour and a half after the end of the debate, in May 2004, the jury delivered their verdict. Larry was found guilty of aggravated first-degree premeditated murder. The prosecutor's office also recommended opening cases on other episodes of sexual violence in which Heslett was suspected. And on June 14, 2004, the final hearing in the Tana Woolley case took place. On this day, Larry Heslett was sentenced to death. Of course, no sentence could bring back the deceased daughter and sister. However, the girl's relatives finally felt relief. It turns out that it was not in vain that they tirelessly knocked on the doors of the police station for years. Thanks to their persistence, justice was finally done. Even if 2 decades later. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.